This video is brought to you by Brilliant. On Monday, Reuters reported that, after more than a year of apparently futile negotiations, Israel and Hamas were finally nearing a deal that could bring an end to the war in Gaza. While Joe Biden and his allies were keen to take credit for the breakthrough, it looks like this sudden breakthrough is mostly down to Trump, who's taken the lead on negotiations in recent months via his new Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff. While nothing has been formally agreed at time of writing, a deal looks closer than ever. So in this video, we're going to have a look at this new deal, why it's pretty embarrassing for Biden, and what might happen next. Dive deeper into politics with our magazine, Too Long. Yes, we made a real physical magazine. Find out more by clicking the link in the description. So let's start with a bit of context. Ceasefire negotiations between Hamas and Israel began in November 2023, but little progress was made for the next 6 months or so. The outlines of a deal finally emerged in May when Qatari and Egyptian negotiators proposed a 3-phase deal, which was the basis of the deal President Biden announced in June. Broadly speaking, the first phase involved a temporary ceasefire and the exchange of some hostages for Palestinians imprisoned in Israeli jails. The second phase involved the exchange of all remaining hostages, and the third phase involved a total permanent ceasefire, with negotiations on Gaza's future governance structure. However, while both sides apparently accepted the 3-stage framework, they couldn't agree a deal. The big sticking point seemed to be the hostages, with Hamas refusing to guarantee that they could return them alive. Hamas's role in Gaza post-war governance structure, which Israel refused to countenance, and the IDF's role in Gaza post-war, with Hamas calling for a full and permanent withdrawal, but Israel, or at least parts of the Israeli government, insisting on either a conditional withdrawal or a continued IDF presence in certain parts of Gaza, like the so-called Philadelphia corridor on Gaza's southern border with Egypt. These issues were exacerbated by dynamics within the Israeli government. It seemed as if, on multiple occasions, Netanyahu would agree a deal only to have it rejected by his far-right ministers, namely Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. Netanyahu relied on Ben-Gvir and Smotrich for his majority in the Knesset, and so couldn't go against them without risking a collapse of his government, and thus elections which polling suggested he'd lose. This has since become a point of pride for Ben-Gvir, who released a statement earlier this week essentially bragging about how he'd been able to torpedo previous deals. However, all of a sudden, earlier this week, there were a flurry of reports that a deal was close, and a handful of outlets got their hands on the draft agreement. According to the draft agreement, which Hamas has now said it'll accept, each stage lasts 42 days. In the first stage, there'll be a temporary ceasefire with an increase in humanitarian aid, and Hamas will hand over 33 hostages for a yet unknown number of Palestinian prisoners. In the second stage, all the other hostages will be released once a permanent ceasefire has been established, and the third phase involved sorting out a reconstruction plan for Gaza, overseen by Egypt, Qatar, and the UN. Interestingly, it looks like Israel have backtracked on their demands a fair bit. According to the draft agreement, Israel will accept dead hostages in the first phase, although this will affect how many Palestinian prisoners are returned to Gaza. Israel has apparently agreed to a phased but total withdrawal from Gaza, and there are no provisions in the draft agreement precluding Hamas's involvement in Gaza's post-war governance structure. All in all, it looks eerily similar to a deal that Netanyahu apparently rejected in early July. So what explains Netanyahu's apparent U-turn? Well, it probably has something to do with Trump, who's due to take office next week and has taken the lead on negotiations via his new Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff. It could be that Trump has offered Netanyahu and co. some sort of concessions, maybe American recognition of the annexed bit of the West Bank, or a preemptive strike on Iran, to convince him to agree to the deal. It could be a well-orchestrated dance between Trump and Netanyahu. Trump gets all the credit, and Netanyahu, who'd have to wind the war down eventually, gets to blame everything on Trump when the Israeli right accuses him of selling out. But the most likely explanation seems to be that Trump was just a bit more forceful with Netanyahu than Biden was. This would be consistent with Trump's recent rhetoric. He warned that there would be all hell to pay if no deal was agreed before his inauguration, and posted a video on Truth Social calling Netanyahu a dark son of a bitch only a few days ago. Haaretz, for instance, reported earlier this week that Witkoff forced Netanyahu to hold a meeting with him on the Sabbath. And the Times of Israel separately reported that the subsequent meeting was tense, with Witkoff leaning hard on Netanyahu to agree to concessions. Similarly, Netanyahu's allies have recently been complaining to friendly media outlets that Trump is exerting far more pressure on Netanyahu than he expected. If this is the case, it would be conclusive proof that the US always had leverage over Israel. For context, over the past year or so, there's been a long-running debate in policy circles as to whether or not the US could actually force Israel to wind down its war in Gaza. Critics of the Biden administration suggested he wasn't doing enough to push Netanyahu into a ceasefire, and Biden's defenders claimed that, short of cutting off military support, which Biden was never going to do, there was nothing he could do to affect Israeli decision-making. The fact that, before he's even taken office, Trump has successfully pushed Netanyahu into a ceasefire strongly suggests that the US had sufficient leverage all along. Biden just wasn't willing to use it for some reason. This is deeply embarrassing for the Biden administration. Not only does it look impotent in retrospect, but it's also possible this impotence cost the Democrats the election, given that a non-trivial number of voters either stayed home or voted for third-party candidates to protest the Democrats' support for Israel, and the fact that the escalating chaos in the Middle East contributed to an electorally fatal sense among many voters that Biden's foreign policy had created a more unstable world. So what happens next? Well, Ben-Gvir has already suggested he'll vote against the deal, but other parties have now joined Netanyahu's government. Netanyahu can probably get the deal through without Ben-Gvir's support, especially if Smotrich supports it, which is at least possible. If the deal does pass, it'll be worth keeping an eye on to see if Trump offered any proverbial carrots, like a normalization deal with Saudi Arabia or a preemptive strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, that might become apparent in the coming months. There's a lot of difficult decisions necessary here, and making huge decisions, especially quickly, is difficult, even for world leaders. The good thing is that brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data, programming, and AI. Their interactive classes help build your critical thinking skills through problem solving, not memorizing. So while you're building real knowledge on specific topics, you'll also be becoming a better thinker. For instance, their Predicting with Probability course can help you better understand and assess the world around you. You can learn to wrangle massive datasets, compare distributions, and master fundamental concepts like Bayes' theorem. That might sound a little technical, but with their active learning, you learn this by answering questions like which airline is least likely to have a delay due to weather, and how much more unruly airline passengers have gotten since the pandemic. Data skills are absolutely necessary for navigating the modern world, and Brilliant is the best way to get them. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/TLDR, or click the link in the description. And by doing so, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription.